Hello again. Welcome back to the Rights Tech Summit. Glad you could all join us here today. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started into this next session. We encourage everyone to say hello to the other attendees in the chat room. You can open that window by clicking the chat icon at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and feel free to drop in your LinkedIn profile or your email, or let folks know who you are, what you do, what you're interested in, and we usually have pretty active conversation going on over there. So please do join. If you have questions for any of the panelists, please put them in the Q&A window, which you can open by clicking the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen. Please don't put them in the chat, just because they may get lost in the stream there, and it's much easier for me and the panelists to to spot the questions if you put them in the Q&A queue, and we're much more likely to get around to at least trying to answer them. So today's topic is, or this session's topic is, building a better pipeline for artists and creators and who are due royalties and residuals. And these days, an artist, a band, can record a track in a garage. They can mix it in their bedroom on a laptop, and they can, working through DistroKid or CD Baby, they can get it onto Spotify and Apple Music and all the rest of them, all in a matter of days. And the same is true for other types of creators as well. I mean, there's been a trend recently of authors using platforms like Substack to get their writings to market, sometimes in serialized form, which is kind of an interesting return to the future, or back to the future. That used to be a common way, or at least not an uncommon way of publishing literary works back in the 19th century. And there's so much demand now for video content for streaming platforms that there are many new distribution opportunities and financing opportunities for film and TV producers. So, and even on a non-do-it-yourself level, even on the professional level, commercial level, there are many more avenues that rights owners have to get their product to market. And as the number of potential or would-be licensors for that product grows, there are new use cases popping up like mushrooms after a storm that rights owners can take advantage of. But while the path to market may be getting more direct and faster and shorter, the path of payment of any royalties or residuals that may derive from that market exploitation is getting more complex and harder to navigate by the day. A typical chart-topping song these days could have a dozen or more credited writers signed to a dozen or more publishers, with all sorts of idiosyncratic splits due to each, and to say nothing of the other producer share, session musicians, others who maybe do a piece of whatever action that particular recording may generate. So it's getting more and more complex on that level, even as it gets more efficient at the route to market level. So what to do? Well, we have a great lineup of speakers to try to hash this out. I'd like to ask them to join us. if they would. There is everyone. Oh, Rory was there. There he is. So in the upper corner there, we have Mike Hurst. He is the CEO and co-founder of Exactuals, which is a leading payment platform that started in the movie and television business, but is now working in music and in other verticals. Depending on how you have your view set up, on my other side here is David Marlin. He is the co-founder and president of MetaComet Systems, which is a royalty management and calculation platform used by more than 120 publishers, both trade publishers and academic, educational, university presses. He too has been looking beyond his immediate patch in the publishing industry and has begun taking on clients from other verticals. Rory Bernard is the CEO of Synchtank, which provides the IVORS royalty management system for the music industry that is very widely used and well thought of. And last but absolutely not least, we have Helienne Lindvall, who's joining us actually from outside of Copenhagen, Denmark today. She is the chair of the Songwriter Committee of the IVORS Academy, the organization formerly known as BASCA, the British, am I getting this right? The British Academy of Songwriters, Composers, and Authors. Is that right? Yeah. She's also on the board of that organization and is a singer, songwriter, recording artist in her own right. So thanks all for being here. And I'd like to start with Rory. First of all, was that a fair description of the state of play that I went through at the top? Is that a reasonable, at least bare bones description of the way the market is operating or not operating these days?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, we're seeing, especially across our client base and even wider than that, is there's just an explosion in data coming through, and every royalty run has a 40-50% increase in data coming into them. And it's getting to the point where even if you're running a relatively small company, you're just overwhelmed because you need systems that can handle these sort of data flows, which are no longer in the DIY spectre. Now, and on the other side of things, the artists, the writers, the payees that you're dealing with on this expect an increasing level of transparency from you. They want to see where the money's come from, where your cut's coming out, and how much they're getting in the end of it. So it's all about not only managing the data flow, but also increasing the transparency of how the data flow works, and making sure that all the mechanics in the middle are clear, auditable, and can be trusted to manage it properly.
And David, the music industry is sort of notoriously the the most complicated from a rights point of view. But do similar challenges and stresses exist in the publishing space that at least roughly parallel what Rory was just talking about?
Yeah, Paul, absolutely. There's been a proliferation of self-published authors. So similar to the music industry, there's a lot of people creating their own content without the help of a larger publisher. Sometimes there's been a proliferation of what's known as hybrid publishers in the around the world as well, which their purpose is to help aspiring authors get their books created into market. So certainly that, and also there's been similar to what Rory was saying, there's been a proliferation of data. Sales, we work with publishers that receive sales data from as many as 60 different platforms. And so you're getting sales and, you know, all your digital sales data in 60 different formats, and needing to aggregate and consolidate all that. So yeah, the similar challenges are also there. And we also work in a number of other industries too, like in video games, for instance. It's not all that different. We work with some video game clients as well, and there's a lot of creation of content by individual developers that's creating some you know, some of the similar challenges. And also video games can be made available on multiple different platforms now, and so with relative ease. So you're also getting the data proliferation issues there.
And of course, in publishing as well, there are just a lot more formats than there used to be. It's not just the hardcover and then the paperback.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, there's all kinds of different formats. There's several ebook versions, there's audiobook versions, and then there's a proliferation of bundled content, subscription content. So the ways of getting your content out there are exploding.
Adding to the data management.
Adding to the data management and the challenges. Yeah.
So Mike, Exactuals started in the helping film and television studios, producers, pay residuals to performers and others, other, you know, the creative guilds and so forth. But you then expanded into music because the TV industry wasn't hard enough to deal with. You needed a bigger challenge.
Maybe we weren't quick enough, but it was definitely difficult enough. Yeah, we did. So we began our business, as you said, Paul, focused on film and television residuals. If you don't know our story, you know, the background is that my co-founder and I worked at Oracle in the kind of 2009, 2010 timeframe, and we had studios and guilds as clients, and we just saw this payment problem becoming overwhelming. And so we ultimately started the business when I was in business school a year or two later. And so that was our first market. And we did what a lot of companies do, whether it's well-advised or not, which was we started with the hardest thing we could find. And that was the film and television residuals problem. The volume problem for film and TV is different. So just for background, the volume issue in film and television is a payment volume problem. They're doing millions and millions and millions of payments. If you're a working actor who has been on, you know, a handful of series and shows, you might get paid 1,000 times in a year. So their issue is more volume. When we extended the platform into music a handful of years ago, we found it to more be a metadata problem and an accuracy problem. And to Rory and David's point, a volume of data concern. So it's adjacent, it's different, but the conditions are the same. You've got essentially an upstream payer who wants to send a unique payment to a rights holder with an explanation. And whether the explanation is being driven by, you know, a publishing agreement or a sync license or a collectively bargained agreement in film and TV, it's all going to require more transparency, more detail, and more info, which we provide through Exactuals. And to David's point, you know, the good news is, like, we're on here talking about the difficulties of communication and payment, not demand, right? We don't have a demand problem. It's never been a time in the world where more content was being consumed. So that's great, but it does make the payment and reporting process more complex. And that's where companies like ours and the ones that you have on the panel today really can help.
And Exactuals is really sort of taking, in a sense, a crude sense, taking the output of what David and Rory's companies do. Can you talk? Right. And then making the payments that they have determined are due. Mm-hmm. So, you know, how important is that integration of those systems, rights management, royalty accounting, payments?
The end-to-end integration is the hope, right? I mean, you want to be able to take this massive volume of data that we're receiving almost weekly now and process it automatically. The less manual work required, the better. And there's sort of 3 steps involved. The first step is you have got to make sure you're paying the right people. And certainly, in the book publishing world, David's company handles that entirely around the portions of the music industry that Synchtank operates in and the deals they create. They handle that. And then separately for publishers and for labels, they've got to keep track of all that information as well. We have a product, Royalties.ai, that you can use to help ensure you're paying the right people. And that's really critical. That's step 1. Step 2 is make sure you pay them the right amount. And that's where the calculation engines really come in and are so critical. So David's company for book publishing, Rory's company's recently launched a great service on rights calculation. We also own one called SR1 that works for both publishers and labels. So that calc engine is the next big step, and it's got to be accurate. You got to make sure you pay the right person the right amount. But then that last mile, which is really where Exactuals started its business, of getting someone securely registered, proving they are who they say they are, paying them in their local currency, ideally doing it through direct deposit and not a paper check, is really important. It's kind of an afterthought, but if you do that incorrectly, or if you wind up having to cancel and replace 1,000 checks a year, it's going to be wildly expensive. So those are sort of the 3 steps.
And is the payment piece of that, the last mile,
Mhm.
similar enough that, your payment hub platform is essentially plug and play across different verticals?
That's the goal. Different industries have different, different problems or different focus areas. For the most part, the film and television space pays domestically, at least for the payments that we handle through the guilds. Even foreign talent often have, localized business management firms and accountants. The music world is much more of a global payments issue. So you'll have a, New York-based record label, and 80% of their payments are going overseas and need to be settled in foreign currencies. So, once you've got all of those points addressed, then yes, it does extend into other industries pretty directly. But we had to grow our services substantially to handle what music really needed from us. But we spent years doing it.
Helienne, so far we've been talking about the sort of mechanics, operational issues around royalty management, calculation, and payment. Are there, at least in the music industry where you've worked, is that is there something more fundamental or structural that you think needs to be fixed in addition to the efficiency, the operational efficiency of payments? I know you were following very closely the British parliamentary inquiry into the economics of music streaming, and the report that came out of that inquiry basically recommended blowing the whole system up and starting from scratch. So can you, for those who may be listening who aren't familiar necessarily with that process and the recommendations that came out of it, could you sort of fill them in?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I have to say, with your description in the beginning, that was an understatement. It is a complete mess. Publishing, if you think the music industry is the most complicated with all the different rights, and publishing within the music industry is worse. It's a complete mess. And we've calculated with the IVORS Academy that, I mean, there's hundreds of millions of dollars that get lost, that are we call it black box when they're unallocable, unattributable every year. You just have to look at like the MLC, which was created to distribute money that was unallocable in the US. And the digital streaming services actually sent in like $500 million just for that. And that was for the US. So you can imagine what's going on in the rest of the world. With the fixed streaming campaign. So basically us having the government look into it was something that an artist called Tom Gray, who's on our board as well as the IVORS Academy and the Musicians Union in the UK, lobbied the government to look into this. And we had, if people haven't watched it, it's interesting viewing, even if you're not as kind of involved in British copyright. I mean, it relates to all copyright really, but you had the heads of the major labels testify. You had the heads of all the PRO and the different organizations, the publishers. You had executives from YouTube, Spotify, everyone testified to the ministers of or members of parliament in the UK. And when they came back with their report, they pretty much, I mean, we also submitted written evidence, and plenty of us songwriters and producers and artists submitted personal experiences as well. And when they came back with their report, they pretty much followed everything that we had said about it. And the problem on the publishing side is there is, first of all, I mean, it's interesting because years ago, we tried to create a global repertoire database that would be like sit in the center. So all the performing rights organizations and, you know, everyone would just put all their metadata into one place. Because right now it's all, you know, separated across the globe. And even like the data quality varies a lot. And if you think of that, a writer, if you write a song and you've got writers from 4 different countries with 4 different PROs and different publishers, and they all report what they think the split is and who they think the writer is. It never ever, you know, it's very, very rare that it matches across the board. So what our government basically, I guess they didn't know that the GRD didn't work in the end, because there were performing rights
notorious. Yeah, I mean, it's
because data, a lot of the organizations and publishers as well see data as their value. So they're holding on to their data. They don't want to share it with everyone. And I think
part of the MMA, the Music Modernization Act here in the U.S. was to create, in a sense, a government mandate that you know, data owners cooperate, whereas they didn't. They lacked the incentive to do so with the GRD. What I'm curious about, I mean, when I sort of followed as best I could from across the ocean the hearings and all that went on in that inquiry. But at the time, I wrote to a friend of mine in the British music industry, and I asked, you know, is this real? Is this like, is something going to actually come of this, or was this just some, you know, boomer MPs hoping they'd get to meet Sting if they held these hearings? What, you know, what is what? But then they came out with this really, you know, remarkable set of recommendations that would kind of turn the whole industry on its head.
Well, there were a lot of different, I mean, one of the things was the payment structure in that they recommended equitable remuneration, which is basically, so it would be paid as a broadcast if it was playlisted songs. But on our side, what we have been campaigning for was, well, one of the things was for the Competition and Marketing Authority to look into basically the power of the major labels who also own the major publishers. But since this is like a rights, like metadata handling panel and event, I think also, but part of it is, you know, it was the to create a global repertoire or a repertoire database, but also to not distribute whatever is not allocable according to market share, because I think this is one of our issues in the music industry, that there are the bigger players actually benefit from bad metadata. I mean, they would never actually, say so up front, but when it's unallocable and then gets distributed according to
By
market
market
share,
share.
it means they get paid twice. And most likely the people that don't have their metadata in
they're getting paid twice, often with money that should be going to somebody else. So that's
yeah.
worse of it. So to the rest of the gang, it's we're not certain what's going to come out of that UK initiative. But on the previous panel, we were discussing Article 17 of the EU Copyright Directive, and around the world, a restructuring of all of these industries is happening, in some cases via regulation or legislation, in some cases probably in the majority of cases by simple evolution of the market and consumer behavior changing. What when you're building your systems, how future-proof can you make them? I mean, do you think about this has to if some new means of exploitation of content comes along, is my system going to be able to onboard that?
Yeah, I mean, we're getting clients that are coming through to us that are asking us to predict data volumes in 4 to 5 years' time, and then doing proof of concept tests against our system on those data volumes to make sure that it's that, A, it can handle it in a timely fashion, but B, the accuracy remains as it is, and we don't just go to the market share stuff in order to shortcut the outputs. And you can still provide an auditable way of artists being able to check that you've got accurate data coming out of the other end. And we've noticed that's increased markedly over the last 2 years, where almost every larger client now just has a here's our situation in 2025 and 2030, plug the numbers in and make sure that you can handle it all. So it's increasingly a important part of any planning process that they're putting in systems to say they've got a 10-year plus lifespan, and we want to make sure that those systems can live for those 10 years. And that's backed up by making sure that your company is commercially set up to be able to service a product for that sort of lifespan.
David,
I'd echo that. I'd say in addition to scale, one thing that we're thinking a ton about is security. It's increasingly important, and obviously we're owned by a bank, so we're regulated and we think about it constantly. But if you look at not only the total dollars going through these pipelines and these systems, but the actual volume of payments, both numbers are growing, at a tremendous amount. And being able to automate payments that might be sub-penny is going to be critical. Keeping all of that data, making it accessible quickly is obviously going to be really critical if you're a software provider, but never losing sight of the most important thing as a payments company, which is don't pay the wrong person and don't lose any data. The safest system on the planet is critical. It's hard to do that, to bake it into a sprint plan when you're trying to keep up with a market that's growing so quickly, but it's very, very important.
I think to build on what Rory and Mike were saying too, definitely as they both touched on, the auditability and accuracy is critical to maintain that. Our philosophy is, people like we recently, the end of last year, came out with a new platform. People said, well, when's it going to be done? And we always say it's never done. We build the software to be flexible for the future because we don't know what the future is going to bring. And so for us, it's really important to have a really solid architectural foundation that we can build on and be flexible with. Some of the recent changes that we've seen, for instance, are transparency to royalty recipients. It's a bigger and bigger issue, and it's related to the auditability piece, but also making all that transactional data available to the royalty recipient. So like, for instance, on our online portal now, that was a recent change that was requested. So there's the option now when you download your royalty statement, you can see all the transactions behind that royalty statement. There's all kinds of different business models coming out now. We're seeing an explosion in subscription models that it's important to keep up with, and also just with the proliferation of data is different ways of managing that data, because a lot of the data needs to be enhanced before you can actually calculate royalties on it. So there's a lot enhanced, yeah. Like I'll give you an example. So for instance, in book publishing, there's all kinds of really complex rules as to how royalty can get calculated. A sale will come in, so the contract might say, okay, for foreign ebook sales, pay this rate. So when the sale comes in, it's not flagged as either foreign or ebook. So we have to look up what kind of format that was. We have to look up where it was sold and enhance the sales data with that information so that we can apply the appropriate royalty term for the calculation. That's just one of many examples of where data needs to be enhanced before it can be paid out. And then also, one thing that we're seeing a lot more of is, to Mike's point, is I am surprised, but I'm not surprised at how many companies really struggle with the payment piece, way more than we used to see. For instance, we were and to Mike's security point, we were in conversations. We've been working closely with Exactuals on recently, and we were in one situation where one of our clients, their biggest concern was they had something like 600 payees, and they didn't want to store all that sensitive, personal identifiable information on their internal systems. And so they were a natural fit for Exactuals, which is built, as Mike alluded to, with their enhanced security to handle that information. And that's not a problem that we used to hear about, concerns about that. So there's a lot of ways that you have to keep up, constantly change.
Thanks for the plug, David. That was great. But he's right. And I know the core of the question, Paul, that you were asking as well was, with some of the regulatory changes and the law changes, how does that impact the ecosystem? And David's exactly right. Even existing clients who have historically kept their own sort of bank account information about their payees are realizing that it's a compliance item that they don't want responsibility for, and they're pushing it off to their payment providers. And now that there are more options available and people are paying on a global scale, they also want to take care of their payees. And if you're doing it an old-fashioned way, sending a US dollar check into a foreign market, that payee is really going to be penalized. They're going to have to pay a fee at the bank for having the check cashed. That bank's going to convert the currency at a pretty egregious rate, and $100 might turn into 70, right? And nobody likes that, right? So, the labels and the publishers who are making those payments want to know that they can land, 95, 97% of the dollars in local currency as well. And all that comes from more modern systems.
Just a reminder to folks, if you have questions for any of the panelists, you can put them in the Q&A window, and we'll try to get to them at the end. I had a couple of additional questions. So another thing that's been happening, particularly, well, it was probably happening before COVID, but it's accelerated since COVID, and that is the sort of integration of, or what I refer to as IP crossing the species barrier. You've seen it in music and games, for instance, where music is getting, often live music is getting embedded, within a game. You see, in the publishing world, projects that begin as audio first products that then later become books, but that at the audio stage have may have multiple voice actors. It has sound effects, music, so on and so forth. So the pieces of the pieces of content, the projects themselves are getting more and more complex, and involve more and more different discrete types of intellectual property. In some cases, managed differently, according to the different industry standards. So how does that complicate the picture we've been talking about here? How does that complicate the ecosystem of royalty calculation and payments to anyone?
Can I just say quickly, as coming from the creators and probably, like the ultimate customers of most of you guys here, I think on the music side, it tends to be that music, in particular with the publishing, that music gets used. Most people are not aware that they cannot use, because content creators, everyone's a content creator now, and they don't. They assume that the platforms are taking care of, whatever needs to be taken care of. And obviously, if you look at gaming and a lot of the, Twitch and all the different new platforms, people are completely surprised when then their content is being taken down because they're breaking copyright. I mean, for me, I have to say, I think that it should be. The onus should be on the platform to sort that out, and I think for us, what is happening at the moment is a lot of the time it's lump sums being paid out because it's the easiest thing, and because we're represented by often big corporations, it's the easiest thing for them as long as they get paid. But it then doesn't filter down to us. So the having identifiers and having some sort of like blockchain identifier, watermarks, or whatever you want to use, is really, really important for us. Can I just say a quick thing that just to kind of add to what everyone was saying before? For us, a big part of the metadata problem comes from the beginning of, like, when people are creating music. So I always say, like, garbage in, garbage out. So it doesn't matter how good the PROs are, which a lot of them are not so good, but it's you have to get the metadata from the start in the studio, which is
there are people working on that, and companies like Audley and
yeah, I worked with Audley for years with Bjorn and Bjorn from ABBA and Max Martin, a very big writer. And the problem is, of course, that you're not going to get every musician to use one platform, because everyone has, in the same way they have different operating systems, from Logic to Pro Tools to whatever. So you have to have something that is agnostic in that way. And we're going to, with the IVORS Academy, actually, we have our big awards next week, and we're going to make a big announcement also about educating across the industry of capturing metadata as early as possible.
Part of the
So that's what we really,
Sorry to build on that. Part of the complexity of what you're speaking about is very frequently, maybe not mostly, but a lot of the times, even if you think you've done it, you've gotten it a little bit wrong. Somebody's been left out, somebody was uncredited, et cetera, et cetera. And so it becomes like this living record in music. You need to be able to look it up in real time and not, necessarily trust what you thought to be true 4 or 5 years ago, which is a challenge.
Yeah, and publishers change all the time, obviously.
Totally.
Yeah, these days.
Yeah, well, right. One big change in our industry the last few years, or at least expansion, has been buying these rights as an asset class. So that's totally right. From one quarter to the next, the publisher's share could have changed hands 2 to 3 times at this point. We've got to find a way to keep track.
Thank you, Emma, for putting the link in there with the £500 million a year unallocated. It's good. I recommend reading that report. It's a bit shocking.
Yeah, somebody did what I told them not to do and put a question in the chat on that question, and I guess Emma was responding to that. You did mention the B word, Helienne blockchain.
Sorry about that.
Well, no, we have a whole panel on it coming up. But you know, do you guys think about having to at some point incorporate crypto into what you do, either as a data management system or you know, even as a payment system?
I'll take the payment piece. Rory was about to go there, but you're muted. Go ahead, Rory, if you're about to answer. Sorry.
I was just about to say that climate change and blockchain are two diametrically opposed things, and it's definitely not something that's for today, if you like, I guess. But I can see, you know, crypto is a payment system that comes and goes depending on which one you use. So you have to deal with it in some way. So, sorry, Mike.
Yeah, totally. I'll build on it. So it was said earlier that the issue of garbage in, garbage out. That's right. And like a blockchain is going to replace database, but if your data is bad, the blockchain is not going to help, right? So you've really got to get your metadata problem solved, independent of where you choose to keep it. I will say that, you know, we ultimately pay about 200,000 people, but we work for about 150 companies, right? Our clients are the companies, the payers, and we're ready and we're prepared. We're ready to pay in crypto. We're ready to talk blockchain. We have yet to have a single payer ask for it in earnest. And so it will probably have strength in the DIY community first. And to Helienne's point, in the beginning of recording a work, that's a great use for blockchain. The 6 of us are in the room together. We've agreed on our splits. Let's do it, right? Applying blockchain, you know, in retrospect to 30 years of complex agreements is a much more complicated objective. So we shall see, but we choose to spend our effort, time, and engineering dollars solving the first problem of getting metadata correct before we figure out where we want to hash it or record it.
Yeah, no data, no dosh.
That's right.
I think also if you do it from the start, even if you do have blockchain in the beginning, if people don't want to talk about splits, which writers never want to talk about, because it feels like you're giving somebody a prenup on the first date.
Yeah.
So everybody just pushes that ahead of them. So a blockchain wouldn't solve that unless you had those agreements from the start. And then if you work in, for example, electronic music or hip hop or whatever, that song goes out the door and somebody else adds something else, and then suddenly all those splits have to change again and again, which is,
Well,
you know, we try to.
That's actually just the sort of thing that blockchain actually is good for, is creating that record of provenance and changes to agreements. In the next panel, we have someone from Verify Media, which is, you know, that's sort of what they're working toward. So anyway, we are just about out of time here. If anybody has some, well, we didn't get any questions. I guess we answered all of the possible questions about this. So we give ourselves a pat on the back. If anyone of you have any closing thoughts, we have a little under a minute here, but if there's something you were hoping to touch on that I didn't ask about, speak now.
Just want to say thanks very much for having us, as always, Paul. It's a great forum.
Yep.
Okay.
Thank you, Paul.
Yeah, and what I can add is that actually it was supposed to be today that the government was going to come with their report. So just to kind of say how it works in the UK quickly with the DCMS report, what they basically were waiting to see if they say this needs more, that, you know, we want to take this further. So there's not going to be like a huge response to start off with. The Competition and Markets Authority operate on their own. So hopefully we're hoping that with the Sony AWOL deal that just went down, where they were questioning that maybe that also will bleed into what we've been talking about as well. And to get to the point why one of the reasons that the government understood it so well is that one of the MPs on the committee is actually a songwriter, so and a member of PRS. So he does understand, because otherwise it is quite complicated to understand the ins and outs of publishing.
Okay, I think we have to leave it there. Thanks again to everyone. Thanks to the audience for tuning in. And if you do have additional questions, you can certainly send them to me, and I can try to direct them to the appropriate panelists. We'll be back at the top of the hour, and we're going to be talking about the B word, and hope to see you all there. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.